The only sound in the room was the wind pushing against the window glass, and I remember holding my breath because I was afraid even that would be too loud. My prayer cap was still pinned to my head. My shoes were still on my feet. And across the small room, my husband of 9 hours reached up and turned the lamp down to nothing. The wick went dark, and before I could find a single word in my mouth, before I could say wait or ask one question, he told me what was going to happen now. Not asked, told in the flat certain voice a man uses when he is reading from a rule he believes God wrote himself. Before I go any further, I'm Martha and this is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where I share the things we were raised to carry in silence. I grew up old order in a small district in Indiana, the kind of place where the nearest paved road was a mile from our lane and the outside world may as well have been the far side of the moon. If you want the truth about plain life from someone who actually lived inside it and not the soft postcard version they sell to tourists, subscribe and tap that like button. And tell me in the comments, before you knew any of this, what did you imagine an Amish marriage was actually like behind the closed door? I read every answer. I was 18 when I married Amos. In my world, that was not young. That was right on time. Maybe even a little late because 2 of the girls I was baptized with had already married at 17 and 1 was expecting by the time the leaves turned. School had ended for me at 14, the way it ends for all of us. After 8th grade, books closed forever. After that, your education is your mother's kitchen and your father's barn. You learn to can 300 quarts of tomatoes in a season. You learn to quiet a calicky baby that isn't yours. You learn to disappear into work so completely that you forget to ask what you actually want because wanting was never on the lesson plan. Here is what people on the outside cannot understand. In the plain world, a marriage is not first a love. It is first an arrangement of duties and everyone in the district knows their part. The ordnung, our unwritten code that governs everything from the width of a hat brim to the color of a buggy, does not write down what happens between a husband and a wife when the lamp goes out. It does not have to. The silence does the writing, and into that silence, men pour whatever they were taught, whatever their fathers taught them, and no one is ever there to check the lesson. Amos courted me for 5 months. He was 4 years older, steady, good with horses, the kind of man my father nodded about with approval, which in our home was the loudest praise a person could earn. We never bundled the way some districts allow. In mine, courtship was sitting up. He would come on Sunday evenings after singing, and we would sit in the front room with a single lamp and my younger brothers pretending to sleep on the stairs so they could listen. We talked about the farm we would have. We talked about how many children God might choose to send. He held my hand once near the end, and his palm was rough and warm, and I thought, this is a good man. I am lucky. This is what safe feels like. What I did not know, because no one ever told me, was that the man who is gentle in the front room and the man who is certain in the dark bedroom are not always the same man. Nobody draws you that map. You are simply expected to find the border on your own in the dark with no lamp and no words. Our wedding was on a Thursday in November after the corn was in. I woke at 4 to start the cooking. By noon there were near 250 people filling my parents' house and the barn we had cleaned and swept for 2 days. The bishop preached for the better part of 3 hours on submission, on the wife yielding as the church yields, on the household ordered the way God ordered the heavens, the husband above and the wife beneath, and beneath was not said unkindly. It was simply said as fact, the way you would say the sun is above the field. I sat on the hard bench in my new blue dress that I had sewn myself. And I remember thinking, I can feed 250 people. I can do anything with my hands. But my hands were shaking, and I did not know why yet. After the meal, the roast, the mashed potatoes, the gravy, the pies my aunts had baked in the dark hours of the morning, the guests stayed long. The house smelled of coffee and lamp oil and too many bodies in too small a space. My face ached from being looked at. And then, the way it always happens, quietly, with no announcement, it was time. And we went up the narrow stairs to the room that was now ours. Let me be honest with you the way no one was honest with me. I was not thinking about romance when that door closed. I was exhausted down to the bone. My feet were swollen. And underneath the tiredness, there was a fear so large I could not see the edges of it. Because I had walked into that room knowing nothing. My mother had told me one thing one time the week before, not looking at me, her hands busy in the dishwasher. She said, "A good wife does not make her husband ask twice." And that was the whole of my education. That was the map. One sentence handed to me sideways over a sink. And I was meant to build an entire marriage on it. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead slowly without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part 1 could not say out loud lives. What I can tell you is this. When that lamp went dark, Amos did not turn to me as a question. He turned to me as a conclusion. He had a certainty. I did not have an idea of what a husband was owed the moment the vows were spoken. And that idea did not include asking me a thing. It was not cruelty. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make him a villain. And the truth is sadder and quieter than that. He believed with his whole heart that he was doing exactly what God and the bishop and his own father had told him a husband does. He had been handed the same empty silence I had. The difference was that the silence had taught him he was owed something, it had taught me that I was the something owed. I lay there in the dark in a marriage that was 9 hours old, and I understood in a way that had no words yet, that I had just agreed to something I had never been allowed to read. A contract with the terms left blank, signed in front of 250 witnesses and a bishop, and only now in the dark were the terms being filled in, and I had no pen. Here is the part that took me years to understand. What happened in my room was not a thing Amos invented. It was a thing the system built and then refused to name. In my district, a wife's body was understood to belong after the vows to the marriage, and the marriage was understood to be led by the husband. Her comfort was not a sin to ignore. It simply was not a category anyone had a word for. You cannot ask for what you have never been given language to name. And the men were not taught to look for it because their fathers had not been taught to look for it either. The silence did not skip a generation. It never does. I was not the only one. I want you to know that because for a long time I thought I was. My friend Rebecca married a year before me to a man everyone said was kind, and he was kind in the daylight. She told me once years later in the back of a buggy where no one could hear that for the first 2 years of her marriage she believed her own quiet suffering was simply the price of being a faithful wife. She thought the ache she carried was holy. She thought naming it would be pride, and pride mud is the worst sin we have. So she said nothing to her husband, to her mother, to God in any words she would let herself form. 2 years. And the worst of it, she told me, was not the nights. It was learning later that it never had to be that way, and that the silence had cost her those years for nothing. That is the thing the outside world gets wrong about control. They think control is a locked door and a raised hand. Sometimes it is. But the deepest kind of control in my world was never loud. It was a wife who did not know she was allowed to speak. Married to a husband who did not know he was supposed to ask. Both of them obeying a rule that no one had ever written down and no one would ever say out loud. You cannot break a rule you cannot find. And you cannot ask for mercy in a language you were never taught. I do not tell you this to make you hate the place I come from. I need you to hear that the plain world gave me things the outside world cannot give and does not understand. It gave me a community that really showed up with food and hands and presents for every birth, every barn raising, every grave. It gave me a faith I have had to rebuild but have never thrown away. It gave me a mother who loved me in the only language she had, even if that language could not hold the one sentence I most needed to hear. There were nights later, after I finally found my own voice, when Amos and I sat at the kitchen table after the children slept, and we talked, really talked, about fear and money, and whether we were doing any of this right. He was capable of more than that first dark room. We both were. The tragedy was never that the people were bad. The tragedy was that the silence got to us first. It took me a long time and a great distance to learn the words I am using with you now. I left in my late 20s and the cost came fast and it came complete. The shunning, the letters sent back unopened. My mother's voice gone from the telephone. My father's door, which had once opened to 250 wedding guests, closed to his own daughter. In therapy, on the outside, I learned words that did not exist in my first language. Consent, autonomy, the simple world-changing idea that a woman is allowed to be a person inside her own marriage, that her yes means nothing if she was never permitted a no. I grieved the girl in the blue dress who lay in that dark room with her shoes still on, holding her breath, certain that making her husband ask twice was the only sin in the room. She was not wrong for being afraid. She was not weak for staying quiet. She had been handed one sentence and told it was the whole of what a wife needed to know. And then she was sent up the stairs to learn the rest from a man who had been handed nothing at all. They told us the vows made us adults. But adulthood is not chores and a shared bed and a household ordered like the heavens. Adulthood is knowing yourself well enough to know what you are agreeing to before you agree to it. I was old enough to cook for 250 people. I was old enough to run a household and bury a stillborn child and keep a garden alive through a drought. I was not old enough because no one had ever let me be to understand the single most intimate agreement a person can make. If you grew up in a place where obedience was dressed up as readiness, where silence was called holiness, where your own body was a thing you served instead of a thing you lived inside, I see you. If you were ever handed one sentence and told it was everything you needed to know and then sent into the dark to figure out the rest alone, you are not alone. And you were never the one who failed. The silence failed you. The people who would not say the words failed you, not you. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely.